Well, good morning and welcome to chapter 23. In chapter 23, we're going to look at the other side of the coin from chapter 22. In other words, last chapter we looked at second aorists, and in this chapter we're going to look at first aorists. So there's nothing new in terms of meaning. There's nothing new in terms of how you translate the aorist. First and second aorists are translated exactly the same. The only difference is that of form. Okay? So we just have some form differences to learn. How do you form the first aorist active? Well, it's very simple. You have an augment, you have your aorist active tense stem, and you have a tense formative. Now the tense formative in the future is sigma. The tense formative in the aorist is sigma alpha. And then you add, because it's an augmented tense, you add the secondary active personal endings. Now you notice what's not there. Right, there's no connecting vowel. You don't need one because the tense formative ends in a vowel. So you have sigma alpha. And so, for example, if you have the form luo, you have the epsilon for the augment, the aorist active tense stem, the tense formative sa, and in this case the first person plural ending men, and you get elusamen. And what you'll find is that when you see a first aorist, that sigma alpha is just going to start blinking at you. At least it should. That's the biggest indicator that you're in an aorist tense. Now let me say something about the aorist active tense stem when it's a first aorist. We saw in second aorists that the verbal root comes unchanged into the aorist, and yet the verbal root is changed when it goes into the present. In other words, if you have a second aorist, the second aorist tense stem will always be different from the present tense stem, right? In first aorists, you have what is generally called the regular, although I don't like the word regular. You can see that by now in the textbook. But you have what is generally called the regular formation. In other words, these are the Greek words that are formed regularly. In other words, the present tense stem will almost always be identical to the aorist tense stem. In other words, you have the verbal root lu, and so you go into the present as luo, and you go into the aorist as elusa, and what you have is the same stem, lu, in both the present and in the aorist. So in that sense, the first aorist is the regular formation. Augment, aorist active tense stem, which is almost always the same thing as the present tense stem. Your nice sigma alpha stands out there and indicates aorist, and then your endings. And so in the paradigm you have elusa, elusas, eluse, elusamen, elusate, elusan. Now there's a couple things worth noting here. What personal ending is used in the first singular? None. That's right. And so you have just the tense formative. So you can see how in the first aorist you're different from the imperfect, right? If you have eluon, it's either first singular or third plural, right? Okay, well that ambiguity doesn't exist in the first aorist system because there is no ending used in the first singular, and so you have elusa, but in the third plural you have elusan. So those forms are distinct, and that's nice. But the other thing worth noting is in the third person singular. Do you see what's happened? There's no personal ending used, which is what you're used to. But in order to differentiate first singular from third singular, at least I assume that's the reason, sa, sigma alpha, goes to se, sigma epsilon. Now this is a very common kind of change. We're going to see it in the other tense and in some other places. So in your list you're keeping of the odd little things, your two-page list, the fact that in the third singular sa goes to se needs to be marked on that list. So your form is elusa, elusas, eluse, elusamen, elusate, elusan. Well, we have a little twist in the first aorist. And that again has to do with liquid verbs. Now we've had liquid verbs in the future. And what's the peculiarity of a liquid verb in the future? Master verb chart, you need to know this. I've seen the quizzes, you need to know this. Right. It's you have what is, in essence, a tense formative of epsilon sigma. The sigma's dropping out and you're going to get contractions. Okay. When a liquid verb gets into the aorist, you also have another peculiarity, and that is that the tense formative for a liquid verb is just alpha. In other words, the sigma drops out. Now, one of the things that liquid verbs often do to help is that they can change something in the stem. So, for example, you have the verb meno, that when you get into the aorist, the verbal stem is going to be mu epsilon iota nu. Now, this doesn't always happen, but it often happens. But what you're going to get is something like this, where you have your augment, your sometimes altered stem for the aorist, main, your alpha and your endings, and you get emenamin. So when you see an inflected liquid form, there's going to be a couple of clues as to what you have. The first clue is that the final consonant of the stem is going to be a liquid. And the four liquids are mu, nu, lambda, or rho. Okay, that's one of your clues. Another one of your clues is that other than the third person singular, you're not going to have an omicron or epsilon connecting vowel. You're going to have an alpha. So when you see the ending and you see the alpha in front of it, you go, whoa, wait a minute. This isn't present. And another clue you might have is that if the verb has changed to form its aorist active tense stem, there'll be some difference there. And so once again, you can look at a form like emenamin and you go, is this the form I memorized? In other words, is the stem that I'm looking at the present active tense stem? Am I inside the present tense system? And the answer is no. And you know it's no as long as you've memorized your vocabulary exactly. Because you will have memorized this as mu epsilon nu, not mu epsilon iota nu. Okay? So we have liquid verbs that are a little bit of a bother in the future in the aorist. That's it, by the way. We have one more tense to learn, but the liquids aren't an issue in that tense. And so you see the paradigm of a liquid verb, and liquids are all first aorists. Emena, emenas, emene, with a new movable, emenamin, emenata, emenon. Absolutely regular first aorist, there's just no sigma. Now, just to show you why knowing the rules really helps, instead of giving you 9 more paradigms, I can show you these forms and you know what they are. What's happened with epilepsa? Right. You have a stop, you have a stem ending in a stop, and you already know that a stop plus a sigma forms a psi, right? So epilepsa means I saw. Right. The verb's blepo. So you have epilepsa. You see the psi alpha. Do you know any verbs whose stems end in a psi or a xi? No, you don't. And so when you see psi or xi, you click off, there's got to be a sigma wrapped up in here. What forms with a sigma to form a psi? A labial. And you can work backwards from there. So in other words, stems ending in stops will go through the same kind of changes that you're used to with some third declension nouns and in the future. Okay? Does anybody know what's going on with the third form? Eboptissa. Right, the dental's dropping out. Go, wait a minute, I thought the verb was baptizo. That's right, but you memorized the root as baptid with a delta. See, here's an example of why knowing the roots is so important. If you try to go from baptizo to eboptissa, you just have to memorize it as an irregular form. But if you know that the root is baptid, the word is absolutely regular through all the different tenses. If you know that the stems actually end in a dental. Cool, huh? Look at all, there's 9 paradigms you don't have to memorize now. You're welcome. How do you form a first aorist middle? Well, like in the future, in the aorist, the active and the middle are distinctly different forms. They're built on the same tense stem, But the only difference is they're going to use middle passive endings. And so, for example, you're going to end up with the form elusamein. And so you have the paradigm elusamein, eluso, elusata, elusamatha, elusastha, elusanta. Okay, you have to watch the second person singular. There's been some contractions that have occurred. It's all regular. Can you see how that just sigma alpha should just bounce out at you? Just say, look at me, look at me, look at me. I'm a first aorist, first aorist, first aorist. And by the way, people often ask on parsing, do you have to designate whether it's a first or second aorist? No. At least as far as I'm concerned. I don't care whether you so much recognize as a first or second aorist because it doesn't affect meaning. I want you just to say it's an aorist. In the word of a great theologian of the century, it's back. It keeps growing. You want to learn it, right? Every chapter you want to learn the 1 or 2 lines that you get. This thing just keeps growing. But it's nothing compared to all 900 and some odd forms in the big chart. I just want to keep saying that to keep things in perspective. So what we have here are several more lines. You have a first aorist active, augment, aorist active, sa, secondary active. You get elusa, a liquid aorist active. Then you got first aorist middle. And for some reason, I'm not really sure, I don't include first aorist middle liquids. After a while, it's so obvious what these things are, I didn't want to include everything in this chart. So things that are easily figured out, I didn't include. So there's your 3 new lines to learn for the master verb chart.